Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to the Wednesday evening online seminar. Today we are joined by Ryland Ash, Managing Partner from Insolvency Ash, who's going to be talking about insolvency and cash flow in the construction industry. As always, the recording will be available afterwards as will your CPD certificates. And if you have any questions for Ryland during the presentation, if you pop them into the Q&A box in the bottom toolbar, and he will endeavour to answer as many of those as possible for you. Again, as always, if you have any specific questions that isn't covered during the seminar or you'd like to ask Ryland's advice on, his email address will be in the slides, and it's rylandash@silverllp.com. Please feel free to contact him. Without any further ado, Ryland, I will hand the floor to you.
Julie, thank you very much, and welcome everybody, and good evening. If you've not been to one of my seminars before, I'll give you a brief background to myself. I qualified as a barrister, went to work in chambers for a short period, and then went out to Southeast Asia on a large design and build project. Stayed there several years and then came back to the UK and qualified as a solicitor. And I now find myself at the top of the tree at Insolvency Ash, specialising in construction law. Over that period, I've seen the recessions in the UK. When I started, it coincided with one, and when I came back from Asia, that also coincided with a recession. And so I've seen my fair share of insolvencies. And I've also seen the development of the law surrounding insolvency and construction law, and how that's come along within the years that I've been qualified. And things have improved slowly in terms of the safety nets, if you like, that exist, but there's still a long way to go in terms of what can be done by new laws, by improving practices, by companies being run in a more efficient way, and by better advice being given at the right time, I think is a very important point. And so one of the things that I heavily recommend to our clients is that they take advice early on, that they are continually updating their skills and understanding about these issues. And so I'm pleased to say that you're all on the Christmas list this year, because you're at this seminar, which means you'll be, one perhaps even slightly sort of one small step ahead of others in the industry for learning more about these subjects. But it's really obviously an important issue. There's some interesting trends developing at the moment, as you can probably imagine, and I will come on to those in terms of what the stats are. But I have heard that 99% of stats are made up. So where I quote the Office for National Statistics, obviously I'm not suggesting that they're not accurate, but what I am saying is, be careful about what those stats represent and what they mean. But nonetheless, we'll take a look at those, and then we'll look at some of the principles that relate to insolvency in the context of construction, and then see what it is you can do, in my view, to improve your chances of avoiding it, recognizing it earlier, and what happens when it does happen. So looking at some of these stats, liquidation rates, statistics for England and Wales for Q1 this year, you can see that there are, big numbers here in terms of the companies, but what do those numbers mean in the grand context of things? If you look at the next slide, it gives some context. So in the 12 months ending Q1 this year, the construction industry had the highest number of underlying company insolvencies, with just over 3,000. And that's really, the number that is important in this seminar. The construction industry also saw the largest decrease in underlying insolvency volumes when compared to the 12 months ending Q4 2019. And these figures here are up to March, which of course is pre-COVID-19. So you can see two things there. One is that construction gets the sharp end of Insolvency Trends, unfortunately, and that doesn't look like it's changed, as we'll see when we get to the Q2 numbers in a moment. And the second point is that there is a broad trend, it seems, of a reduction in the overall insolvency volumes, which is encouraging. It means that things had shifted up until that point, but let's not speak too soon, because as I've said at the bottom there, this is pre-COVID-19 statistics. So what can we expect the trend to be? Well, if we look on at Q2, and forgive me, this may not have been in an earlier version of the slide, so this upgraded version of the slides will be available and will be sent to you in due course. But if you can follow me into the slides here, overall numbers in England and Wales in Q2 this year fell by nearly 1/4 since COVID-19 when compared with Q1, and by 1/3 when compared with the same quarter in the previous year. So massive drops there. The company liquidation rate also fell in the 12 months ending Q2 2020 to 36.9 per 100,000, which is how they generally historically have been measured. In England and Wales, from 40.7 per 10,000 seen in both the 12 months ending Q1 2020 and the same quarter a year ago. Now, historically, the worst numbers for insolvencies have been in 1993 was the very, very worst. And then we had a spike in 2008, but we're nowhere near those numbers. And you can see that significantly these numbers have come down, which is normally an indicator that the economy is growing. But I'm not so sure we can make that conclusion at the moment. So why have these numbers fallen in Q2 is the question, the burning question you're all asking yourselves just before you have your dinner, I'm sure. And there's some answers here which I have offered. The reduction in company insolvencies is likely to be at least partly driven by the government's measures put in place in response to COVID-19. And they include the reduced operational running of the courts, reduced HMRC enforcement since the lockdown on 23rd of March. We've also got temporary restrictions on the use of statutory demands and certain winding up petitions, leading to company liquidations. That was from 27th of April, and that was extended to the 30th of September under the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act. And then you've got enhanced government financial support for companies and individuals, such as the furlough schemes. And then you've got the financial service regulators having advised that individuals and businesses in financial difficulty should be treated with forbearance and consideration and a bit more tolerance and forgiveness. So you can see that although numbers have come down dramatically, there seem to be some logical reasons for that. And I'm afraid that those factors mean that we're not necessarily out of the woods. And in fact, that there may be a big swing once the courts are back up and running and these provisions, presumably some of these measures won't continue forever. And on that basis, we may see some of the trouble actually coming out in the next few months. But certainly for the time being, there has been a slowdown in terms of statistics in respect of those insolvencies. In terms of construction, this is quite interesting and again seems to be encouraging, but I wouldn't read too much into. The three industries that experienced the highest number of insolvencies in Q2 were obviously, again, construction, but that number's 2,778. If you remember, Q1 was just over 3,000. So there is a drop there in terms of construction. and obviously wholesales, accommodation, and the poorer food services industries have been hit hard as well. But construction's still top of the tree, I'm afraid, in terms of insolvencies of any group in almost every quarter since Q1 2018. And so, as I said, it tends to be the sharp edge of things when it comes to insolvencies, and we'll look at why that is. So with insolvency generally, where you start is a fairly basic and helpful starting point in the Insolvency Act 1986. And that gives you a definition of what insolvency is. And what it says is that it's an indication of a company's inability to pay debts as they fall due. So that's obviously as and when they fall due, because if they're due, there's a time frame involved. So the question is really a very basic one: can a company pay its debts when that happens? And the answer is not always a straightforward one, because of the sophistication of the way that companies and projects are set up, in particular in construction, and the number of different moving parts and parties involved, which we'll go into a bit more detail on later. But that's the first test. And then the second test is known as a sort of balance sheet test, where you establish whether or not the value of the company's liabilities are greater than the value of their assets. Do they outstrip one another? And if that's the case, then on that basis, again, there is a definition there which would constitute insolvency. So they're the tests, and of course applying those tests based upon the information that you have, that information being accurate, is an art in itself, but that's what accountants are for. And so if you pass those tests, then the question is, in law, or what are the consequences? And there can be various consequences depending on the form of contract, or if you have a contract at all with the other party. It is worth mentioning that that's obviously not the only definition of insolvency. You can, in your contracts, agree a different definition. And if you look at the JCT contracts, which I mentioned later, they have their own definition of insolvency. Effectively, when it comes to contracts and the right to terminate those contracts in the event of insolvency, you can give insolvency any definition that you like. And so it's worth bearing in mind that it's not always a straightforward case of applying this two-stage test under the Insolvency Act. It may be that you are technically insolvent under a contract based upon the definition that that contract gives to it. In terms of the rules, as I mentioned, the government's obviously made changes to protect parties during what was undoubtedly a very difficult time for companies. So on the 28th of March, following a Down Street press conference, a number of points were made. A temporary suspension of the wrongful trader rules under the Insolvency Act to act retrospectively from the 1st of March. The idea there was that there wouldn't be such stringent tests applied to the way that directors were running their companies and about trading their companies and making payments, because it was the case up until the suspension of those rules that if a director, for example, was aware that the company was technically solvent based upon, let's say, for argument's sake, the Insolvency Act test wasn't able to pay its debts when due, or that its liabilities outstripped its assets, then if they're aware of that and they continue trading, there are ramifications for breaches of fiduciary duties. And in a worst case scenario for a director, it could be that they could be made personally liable for payments or actions that they take. And so those rules being suspended gave directors a bit more flexibility in what was clearly, very difficult times, to allow them to get back on their feet. Obviously, the problems with supply chains, access to places and sites, and obviously staff access, and all the other things that came with the lockdown. But that was the reasoning behind that. And then there was a further ease on the burden of regulation on companies, for example, a 3-month extension to file accounts with Companies House, again, to relieve the burden somewhat during that time, in face of what was a very difficult time to administer anything. So really, the next issue is about the difficulties that arise when the nature of construction is considered. So in construction, why is it that construction is the top of those league tables? Why is construction so risky? And some of the answers are here. The construction industry is risky because it's multi-layered. Obviously, you have a system of different parties with interrelationships where they share risk, and they have different stress points in terms of whether it be the risk of ground conditions, whether it be the risk of design, or whether it be the risk of operations on site, access, and managing sites, and rectifying and getting things done on time. And it will very much depend upon the way that the contracts are structured as to where that risk lies. I always say that construction contracts are really only about one thing. They're about the allocation of risk. And so the way that contracts are set up, the way that they're drafted, the provisions that they include and don't include, are all things that will ultimately dictate where these stress points are, because they will dictate where the risk is allocated. Second point, poor alignment of all parties involved or required to discharge a main contract. Main contractors get a lot of stick. It's not an easy job. You have to keep clients happy. You have to accept risk, and then you have to allocate it appropriately. It's not a difficult. It's not an easy task, that, to balance all of those moving parts. Having said that, some main contractors can cause problems by not paying people as soon as they should. And we'll come on to a good example of that in the next slide, and the red flags that may raise. But I think we go back to the principle that cash flow is the blood lifeline of construction, to use the words of Sir Michael Latham. And that ultimately, if we stop the cash flow, we end up with bigger problems on projects, because it means that companies go bust, and the supply chain gets broken, and delays invariably are caused one way or another. That's bad news for funders and investors. So alignment of parties is very important. Analysis of the value of the construction contract, accruals and reporting. Well, that goes to, I guess, the second most important part to construction contracts, which is administration. The proper administration of those contracts, keeping records is fundamentally important, and also pulling together meaningful records and reports that can tell you an accurate reflection of progress, and can tell you where problems are arising, and also can identify differences between the parties early enough so that they can be resolved, hopefully, and not end in a costly dispute. And so that's the fourth point. And the last one on this page, multiple contracts and crossover of liabilities within organizations. Talking about internal crossover, and obviously the number of contracts being placed. I mean, if you look at the overall spread of construction contracts, it's something like over 90% of all construction work is actually undertaken by SMEs. So that shows you the split, really, how fragmented construction projects are. So Carillion obviously is a good example, and what happened to the Carillion ship that sank. What's the construction industry learned? Well, we've all learned to be careful and read the writing on the wall in terms of bigger organizations that were growing, seemingly, where sales continued to rise, but payments became increasingly slow. And sometimes organizations are so big that it's difficult to keep tabs and see the wood for the trees. But listening to rumors, can be a terrible thing to do in many situations. But in others, when it relates to payments, often the truth will come out. So that was the first point. The second point was the margins. Everybody at that time was aware, and even now, the construction industry, when it sort of bounced back a little from 2008 and 9, it got to the point where margins were being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And this is an example of where they were squeezed too far. And that, coupled with long payment provisions not being managed out down the chain properly, meant that there were stress points in this business that weren't identified early enough. And really, they're the key points of what we've learnt went wrong. And so we need to avoid those things happening in the future. A good mantra for construction is that turnover is vanity, profit is sanity. It's not just about the size, it's about the efficiency and the profitability. And if you keep your eye on that, you'll have a good advantage in terms of keeping things lean and working well and being flexible enough to weather the storms that construction invariably brings. So construction and smaller companies alike will suffer from both external influences and internal stress points. But construction still suffers from behavioural trends and habits, including the nature of how tenders are accepted, the informality around that, and the fact that things aren't always recorded and in writing and in clear terms, and that contracts are not signed, or if they are, they're not adhered to, and the procurement process itself. They're all very deep-rooted problems in construction over the years, which really need to be addressed from the root. And so these are things that must improve if construction is to maintain resilience during difficult times. So looking at some external influences, including other parties, unusual or disproportionately long payment terms, especially with low margins. So those two factors that were fatal for Carillion. Onerous clauses relating to the classification of risk. This is where smaller companies perhaps are doing quite well, growing quickly, but don't want to spend money on good lawyers like myself to review contracts. That's very short-sighted. Coming from a person with glasses, it's an investment that needs to be made, because if you're not checking on the level of risk properly that you take on, then growth will quickly be reversed and you'll have serious problems. So checking, reviewing, drafting, getting contract terms set up properly, these things do require investment in the same way that you should be thinking about investing in things for your business. Perhaps not offices at this time, but certainly other things, infrastructure and so on. This is just as important, if not more important, really, as an investment. So classification of risk, fundamental on that. Variability of cost components, especially over the life cycle of longer projects. not having provisions that deal with currency exchange rate changes, increases in prices. These are big problems on bigger projects that sometimes when they can become disproportionately large if obviously if it's a large aspect of the work. So having the foresight to look for those things and having provisions in your contracts which reflect them is really important. Interaction and dependencies on performance of others, including upline insolvency, obviously dealing with that in the contract properly and in a way that protects the risk, and pay when paid clauses. It's amazing that you go back to 1996 and you see the amendments to the Construction Act and the amendments subsequently to the Construction Act outlawing provisions in contracts that say that you can pay someone when you get paid. But ultimately, that's not been legal since then, and yet provisions will fail, and yet people still do it, or they rely upon that, or they'll just say, you know, I'll pay you when I get paid, and that's it. That's not on, and it's not been legal for some time, as I say. So an awareness of that is often a very powerful thing, and obviously sticking to it and maintaining your rights, enforcing your rights as they arise. Multiple contracts with similar issues, cross-contamination of successful projects. So, you know, you're going to get situations where you've got a number of contracts and they may face the same issues that could come to a head and really push a company into difficulty. So it's about identifying those risks early on and obviously getting rid of the bad jobs in an amicable way. Is something that requires a lot of commitment and resources, but certainly that's the way to do it. Weed them out first and then deal with them efficiently if you're stuck with a bad egg. Internal influences are obviously different in terms of an organization. You may have poor alignment between realization of costs and cost reporting. So it goes back to the reporting point. You know, are you actually recovering monies that you're owed, and if not, if the gap between what you're claiming and what you're being paid is a growing one, then you need to deal with that. You need to commit resources to it, and you need to take legal action if necessary. Maybe an adjudication early on sometimes sets the tone. It may not sound like the best thing, and it may sound like I'm trying to sell it, but it ultimately does help with cash flow. And at this time, I think before, you know, there's likely to be an increase in pressure on construction, despite the figures, for the reasons I've explained. I think that's important to do. Poor application or realization of the common intention at the time of contracting and proper redress available. That's 2 points. I mean, one is to get the contract documents set up in a way that they reflect what the parties expect. That's not always the case, believe it or not. Often clients are left disappointed because they think that they were going to get something and they didn't end up getting what they wanted. And when you look at the contract documents, it's not a surprise. So alignment in the contract is important, and proper redress is really, you know, about the rights you have under that contract for changes, for the power to make changes and how they'll be valued, flexibility under those contracts. So in terms of contract terms, that's an issue that can be dealt with from the outset. Lack of enforcing of those terms when periods of late payment or undervalue of the works repeat. That's the same point I made at the beginning of this slide. You must enforce those rights and don't give other parties too much slack in that regard, because it may be that that's a suggestion that there are deeper problems with the company. Poor identification of the rules surrounding recovery of things like loss and expense variations or extensions of time. So understand what the requirements are, have your contract set up in a way that's clear to deal with them, such as the issue of COVID-19. Do your contracts now state whether it's a relevant event, relevant matter, in what circumstances, will there be an entitlement to extra time? All of these things now need to be addressed. along with all the other risks on your particular project. So what are the signs? Well, these may sound obvious, some of them are, but you need to look out for cash flow issues in terms of companies that are paying you. Are they paying you slow? Late payments to supply chain or employees is a good example of deeper problems. Persistent repeated rumors. As I said, pay attention to these things, even if you ignore them later. They could be very relevant to cash flow and then ultimately insolvency issues. Late filing of accounts, look out for these. Put some reminders on your systems, get people to check Credit Safe and other credit agencies regularly, and check Companies House. Obviously, winding up petitions. It's pretty obvious that there's plenty of winding up petitions being issued against the company that there are problems, but this is a way of monitoring the risk and then disruption to the progress of the works. Why is it that there may be disruption or delays? You need to perhaps look a bit deeper if the telltale signs are there. So there are a few pointers there. So what can you do as a party to one of these contracts or as an advisor? Well, the key to it is going to be due diligence from the outset. And by that, I mean, understand who it is you're getting into bed with contractually, having the contract set up in the right way, checking out how the company is funded, what their trading history is, what are their credit ratings and so on. Obviously references. If it's a new company, when was it set up? How is it set up? By whom and why? Is it an SPV, special purpose vehicle, in which case there should be red flags? And if so, not the end of the world, as long as you get some kind of security in terms of a parent company guarantee or even personal guarantees, director guarantees. Alternatively, you could get insurance. You could use potentially a project bank account. So money's kept in that bank account and released from time to time, gives you some security. You could have escrow accounts set up or use an escrow agent, which can hold on to money. There are lots and lots of things you can do to protect yourself. One of the most obvious ones is, to me, and I know this is a regular problem, is not getting into contract with the correct party. I mean, it sounds obvious, but there are countless companies who will use various different organizations for different aspects of the business. And sometimes parties can't keep up with who they're actually dealing with. How many companies do you deal with, ask yourself, that have a name on a website which is not on your contract? These are sort of schoolboy errors that are made day to day by parties, and often they're only recognized when it's too late. Who's the contracting party? Oh, look, it's a subsidiary company. It's not worth anything. So due diligence is absolutely critical. Payment terms and operation and conditions of contract is obviously, as I've said, something fundamental you need to be doing from the outset. But don't sign up to too long payment terms. Make sure you enforce the payment terms. Make sure they make sense. If they relate to payments on due dates, do the due dates continue throughout a period of delay? In terms of invoices, how do invoices interplay with certificates? Obviously, there's still the prospect of a smash and grab adjudication if there are no pay less notices, but ultimately there's far less of those now because more disputes about the true value of the account following Grove and S&T, the case between those two parties confirming that you can have a true value dispute in relation to a smash and grab entitlement, but you have to pay first and argue later. Then you've got the issue of retention of title clauses, which comes from a famous case called the Ramalpa case, and people sometimes call them Ramalpa clauses. That was a case involving the supply of aluminium foil, and in the contract for the sale of the aluminium foil, there was a provision that said that when we supply you this, we will retain title to those materials, even if they're sold to a third party, unless you've paid for them in full. And that's exactly what happened. They were sold to a third party, they weren't paid for, and then the company went insolvent. And the provision was held to stand up, and they retained title in those goods, which meant that they could recover that value from the insolvency process. So Ramalpa retention of title clauses are important if you're supplying goods, of course, and you should have those provisions in place. But often, surprisingly, in construction, a lot of parties don't. Have your suspension and termination clauses. I'm forever amending these. I'm a big fan of making suspension a pretty immediate reaction to lots of breaches. So if you don't get paid within a few days of your payment date, you can suspend your works, and that often gets people to sit up. And so look to use suspension for non-payment. And then obviously the termination clauses you'll have in most standard forms of contract, but do they cover all the scenarios you want to? Look at that definition of insolvency, for example. Does it cover CVAs or reports, financial reporting and so on? Or if there's generally problems with a company reported, do you want that to trigger certain rights to terminate? Do you want broader rights to terminate, and what are the consequences of that? So termination clauses is a place where you certainly start to look at and improve your the risk, reducing your risks in your contracts in relation to termination. Collateral warranties and third-party rights I've mentioned, but that's another way of de-risking a project, making sure that you get collateral warranties that backed by insurance in relation to design, in particular. There are, however, issues relating to insurance in relation to cladding, for example, where insurers are now saying that they won't cover in relation to certain cladding issues. So be aware of these types of risks if you are involved in projects where there's cladding. Being aware of those types of risks and getting sufficient cover in your contracts is fundamentally important. As I mentioned earlier, if you're dealing with a company over which you have questions, about their solvency or financial state, perhaps not now, but maybe in the future, or you can foresee problems, then parent company guarantees. If the parent company is worth the money, then of course that's a good option. Third-party Rights Against Insurers Act 2010 allows you to bring a claim against the insurance company rather than the company against or with which you had a contract. So that's good news. But if you obviously need proof of the insurance at the time and have a good claim, of course there'll always be a battle with insurance companies in terms of paying out for that, but at least you have some protection there. So determining the underlying issues within the construction industry and the foreseeability of issues is really the general point here in terms of what you can do to protect yourself and avoid insolvency itself. Finally here, just a mention of the JCT provisions, specifically in relation to insolvency. So clause 811 to 814 gives you a definition of insolvency under the DNB this is, which is different to the Insolvency Act, as I mentioned. So that's a good starting point in terms of amendments, but the right to, or the definition of insolvency and then the subsequent right to terminate is set out expressly there by the JCT contract. Clause 8.5.1 to 5.3 sets out the rights of the employer to terminate the contract in the event of contractor insolvency. And then you've got employer insolvency covered by 8.10. But note the different consequences there, depending on whether it's an employer or a contractor insolvency. For example, the right of the contractor to claim for loss of profit or loss of expense as a result of the insolvency only where the insolvency comes about as a result of something that's not their fault or not their insolvency. the insolvency of the employer, for example. So you have different remedies depending on which provisions you rely on and how the insolvency came about under the JCT contracts. Obviously, there are variations on this theme in various different standard forms of contract. And of course, you can have bespoke provisions that deal with insolvency in a particular way. So in conclusion, you can see that although the statistics suggest that insolvency is reducing over time, which was encouraging, unfortunately, I think that this will be short-lived, and I think that there will be an increase in cases. Hopefully it won't be too dramatic, but hopefully some of the things that we've discussed tonight will give you a heads up in terms of how to identify these problems early, start to put into place frameworks that can protect you against these issues, and obviously protect against them in the future by making sure that you get proper advice early on or at the time there's an issue, and by all means you can contact me in this regard. So thank you all very much for listening. I hope that this was a useful seminar, and I'm going to pass over to Julie now for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, looks like we don't have any questions unless there's any latecomers in. It looks like you've explained everything beautifully. Thank you, Ryland. So no one has any questions because you've told them everything they need to know. If there are any questions or something anyone doesn't want to put out in open forum, obviously this can be quite a sensitive subject, please don't hesitate to either call us or to email Ryland directly, rylandash@silverllp.com, and I'm sure he'll be able to help. So if there's no questions, then that will wrap it up for this evening. Thank you, Ryland, and thank you everyone for your time and attending, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon. So take care and stay safe, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.